Hi, I'm Jillian. Thank you for joining me. In my work as an academic writer and editor, I have observed and been guilty of 5 pitfalls that are relevant to high school essays, undergraduate and graduate papers, dissertations, journal articles, and books, all of which I'll call manuscripts. In this video, I'll identify each pitfall and give my thoughts on why and how it should be avoided. Pitfall 1, off task. I can guess what you're thinking. Too obvious. But is it? Some teachers, professors, editors, and publishers are very particular about their preferences and expectations and provide explicit instructions regarding content, organization, length, punctuation, citations, and other requirements. If they have provided this level of detail, you can bet your work will be assessed accordingly. So give them what they want. You might write a well thought out and articulated manuscript, but if it's the wrong type, off topic, or not conceptually or technically formatted as specified, you're at the mercy of the reader and your work may not be judged as well as you had hoped. So, for example, if the task is to analyze and provide an opinion on policy for standardized testing, don't focus on the history of school assessment. If the task is to review the political, social, and cultural contexts that led to war, don't write about the weapons used during the war. If the instructions say that the first paragraph after the introductory paragraph should be the views of author A, the next paragraph, the views of author B, and the final paragraph, your opinion on which author is more compelling and why, stick to that plan. However, providing copious amounts of detailed instruction does not necessarily equate with clarity. Too much detail can also undermine clarity and introduce inconsistencies. You would not believe how confusing and convoluted some school assignments can get, despite the educator's best intentions. If the instructions are unclear, don't guess or go rogue. Ask for clarification several times if necessary as your manuscript is developing. You can assume more leeway, though, if the instructions are limited, but I still prefer to err on the side of caution. Before you lock in your plan, consider verifying that it will meet the requirements and expectations. A tip: regularly review the instructions while the manuscript is developing, so you can quickly spot where and how things are going astray, and you can make changes and corrections while it's relatively easy to do so. So the solution to avoiding being off task: assume that all instructions and guidelines are requirements for success and follow them. Pitfall number 2, disorganized. If your manuscript isn't well structured, it will be difficult for readers to follow, even frustrating. This is obvious in principle, but not necessarily in practice. Those who begin a manuscript by putting pen to paper are taking a risk with academic writing. Instead, begin by making a plan for how the themes, ideas, and concepts will be organized around your core thesis, point of view, or opinion. So, for example, if your manuscript will be chronologically organized, how will you divide the time frames? What are the main ideas within each time frame? If your manuscript is thematic in nature, what are the main themes? What are the sub-themes within those main themes? What are the concepts for each sub-theme? I like to create a flow chart to map the themes, ideas, and concepts and how they're all connected to each other. The plan that you make here defines the unique structure of your manuscript and becomes its conceptual or theoretical framework. For more on conceptual frameworks, see step 5 of the video, 9 steps for creating a research essay or literature review paper, or see the same article. I'll put the link to the article in the description below. Importantly, your framework should be made visible to readers so they're guided through the manuscript. The tools for doing this are titles, headings, subheadings, introduction or topic sentences and paragraphs, concluding sentences and paragraphs, table of contents, and a roadmap of themes, which is a brief preview of the themes that are coming. Usually we find that at the end of an introductory paragraph or chapter. Which tools you use and how depend on the scope and scale of your manuscript. For example, Multiple subheadings may disrupt the flow by creating too many hard stops for readers. So, particularly in smaller manuscripts, subheadings should be replaced by new paragraphs with strong introductory sentences that signal your switch to a new idea or concept. So, for example, I might replace the heading developmental discipline with the sentence developmental discipline offers teachers an alternative approach to dealing with poor student behavior. This theory involves blah, blah, blah. While the manuscript is in development, go overkill on headings, subheadings, subheadings, even subheadings if your manuscript is very long. This will help you keep things organized according to your conceptual framework. In the later edits, you can remove the levels of headings that you don't need and replace them with introductory sentences. So the solution to avoiding a disorganized manuscript is to create and make visible a conceptual framework for your manuscript. Pitfall 3, too many voices. Adding direct quotations from other sources brings flavor and credibility to your manuscript, and it gives readers a break from your voice. But don't allow your voice to be overshadowed by others. This would undermine the purpose of your manuscript. Here are a few guidelines. The number of quotes to include depends on the length of the manuscript. A longer manuscript can hold more quotes without compromising the author's voice. For a 1,000-word manuscript, for example, consider 2 to 3 quotes. A 2,500-word manuscript, 6 to 8 quotes, and a 6,000-word manuscript, 16 to 20 quotes. And make sure you spread these quotes evenly among the sections of your manuscript, just for balance. The length of the quotation matters as well. I tend to avoid quotes that are longer than 2 sentences in small manuscripts and 3 to 4 sentences in medium manuscripts, selecting only the portion of the quote that's relevant. There are exceptions, however, when dividing the original material will compromise clarity or meaning. Tip: when you take quoted material out of its original context, be super careful not to misrepresent the author's meaning or intent. If there is a risk to this, you can provide a little explanation in your own words. Finally, don't quote for the sake of quoting. Be intentional. Include quotes that substantiate the points you're making, such as adding a detail, an example, an illustration, or quotes that express a point more eloquently or concisely than rephrasing or paraphrasing would. Otherwise, prioritize your own voice and add the citation where applicable. Once you've determined the quotations, make sure that you connect them to your ideas. Don't let them just hang in your manuscript, assuming that their significance will be obvious to readers. This will help to ensure the internal coherence of your manuscript and accurate crediting of the original work. Sometimes this is as simple as saying, author A provides an example of this from their own research on school principals. Or you may need a little more of an explanation, such as, the idea is explored by author B in a related discussion on blah, 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 where they blah, blah, blah. A final tip on quotes. Don't begin your manuscript with someone else's voice unless that voice is iconic to the content area. So the solution to avoiding too many voices in your manuscript is to be discerning when selecting and integrating quotes. Pitfall 4, Jargony. Many believe that jargon should be avoided in academic work. I think that position depends on what is meant by jargon. For me, it's the vocabulary associated with a topic. So not using that vocabulary when writing on that topic can weaken a manuscript in the eyes of colleagues and peers. The trick is to know your readers and avoid alienating them. If you're writing for a trade journal, you can likely fill your manuscript with jargon. But if you're writing for the public, that's not the case. And even when readers might be familiar with the term, they may not know what you mean by it in the context of your work. So explain, describe, interpret, and contextualize. This is sometimes referred to as a descriptive or conceptual definition, and it can't be found in a dictionary, so don't go there. Tip: academic work is generally situated in a particular body of literature. So refer to that body of literature and the resources you'll be citing in your manuscript. How are these authors using the term? If there's variation or discrepancy among them, whose use will you use and why? I might write in my own work, in this paper, the term moral refers to that which is good, right, caring, and virtuous in the tradition of Aristotelian virtue ethics. For example, and then I provide an example to illustrate what I mean. You can provide an endnote or a footnote for further discussion or expansion on a term, but this should be an aside or enrichment and not necessary content for the reader to appreciate your manuscript. The timing for introducing terms to readers is also important. Follow the need to know principle. Generally, when a term is central to the entire manuscript, introduce it in the introduction for the manuscript. If a term is relevant only to a chapter, introduce it in the introduction of that chapter. If it's relevant to a section only, introduce it in the introductory sentence of that section, and so on. In other words, don't load all the terms and definitions at the start, especially if your manuscript is long. It's just too much to ask readers to retain. Some terms can be abbreviated, but I think of this as a shortcut for writers and not necessarily to the benefit of readers, so I advise caution. Use abbreviations or acronyms only for terms and names that will be used throughout your manuscript, that are already well known to your projected readers, and/or are within the context of your topic. Otherwise, write it out in full. Introduce the acronym in parentheses at the first use of the term and continue with the acronym consistently from that point forward. This doesn't usually include headings where the full term is preferable. So, for example, if your paper is on continuing education for teachers, you might want to use the acronym PD for professional development. But if your paper is on the initiation of North American schooling in the 17th century, you likely wouldn't abbreviate the term professional development. Just write it out in full each time. A final note on colloquialisms. I do not include these in my definition of jargon. They're everyday words, phrases, and lingo, usually in spoken language, that are informal and often culturally or regionally specific. Examples include, what's up, y'all, same here, my bad, gutted, and no worries. Except for writing dialogue or anecdotes, they're not considered appropriate for academic work. So the solution to avoid a jargony manuscript is provide descriptive or conceptual definitions for the terms you use. Pitfall 5, overly long introduction. Introductions are not the main event, and they usually only have a few marks, if any, allotted to them. So as a rule of thumb, I would advise that introductions represent 5 to 10% of the manuscript's word count, not including the bibliography or list of citations. I'll do some math for you. If your manuscript is 6,000 words, then your introduction can be 300 to 600 words. If your manuscript is 2,500 words, introduction shouldn't be more than 250 words. If you are writing a dissertation or a book, your introduction will be an entire chapter, but the 5 to 10% rule still applies. So if the book is 82,500 words, your introductory chapter can be between 4,125 words and 8,250 words, which is about 8¼ to 16½ single-spaced pages. It seems to me that smaller manuscripts, maybe less than 5,000 words, tend to have introductions closer to the upper limit of 10%. And as the length of the manuscript gets longer, the word count trends to the lower limit of 5%. But this is not a scientifically derived observation. If your introduction significantly exceeds 10%, consider that you might be starting too broadly, temporally, geographically, thematically, and remove the outer layer, focusing only on what readers need to know to enter the world of your manuscript. An example of a temporal focus is if your manuscript is on moral education in contemporary classrooms, you likely don't need to begin with the history of the Puritans in the 17th century. Instead, begin post-World War II or later. This example is actually from my own writing, where I wrote an introduction that was just way too long. In another example, and this one of geographical focus, if your manuscript is on North American classrooms, you don't need to provide background on classrooms in Asia. Focus on the Western world or even just on North America. An example of a focus that's thematic. If your manuscript is on how pet dogs adapted to COVID lockdowns, you don't need to mention cats, birds, hamsters, fish, or ferrets. A quick note on the more unlikely scenario that you do not have enough content for 5%. Try the opposite and broaden the context. What else would enhance readers' appreciation for your manuscript? Do you expand the time frame, the geographical boundaries, or related themes? In an example, if your manuscript is on the pitfalls to avoid when writing academic manuscripts, you might want to outline your background as a writer and editor and how you came to identify these pitfalls. For more information on how to craft introductions and conclusions, which, by the way, should also be proportional, see the video Guidelines for Crafting Introductions and Conclusions or the article. The link for the article will be in the descriptions. So the solution to avoid an overly long introduction is to narrow the context and include only what readers need to know to appreciate your manuscript. It should go without saying that addressing these 5 pitfalls is in addition to attending to spelling, grammar, punctuation, and consistency with the use of italics, quotation marks, underlining, indents, etc., 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 all of which affect the readability of your manuscript. Some can even change your intended meaning. I refer you to Lynn Truss's book, Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, for some entertaining examples on how, and I'll put the link in the description. Whether the reader is your teacher, professor, editor, publisher, or colleague, the nature of their reading experience may determine the success of your manuscript. Ultimately, crafting a coherent, cohesive, and concise academic manuscript involves making several judgment calls that entail consideration for the nature of your work, topic area, scope and scale, potential audience, and desired goals. As the author, you must make these judgment calls, but as the author, you're in the best position to do so. And they do get easier with experience, so keep writing. I'd love to hear from you. Please share your own experiences in the comments below.